All right, let's go over the parachute equipment. From the front, at the top, you can see the 3-ring release system, which is designed to get rid of your main parachute if there's an issue. You can also see the cutaway handle, the reserve handle, chest strap, and leg straps. The reserve parachute must be repacked every 180 days by an FAA parachute rigger. During this inspection, the rigger goes through every line, seam, and piece of material to ensure that it's in good working condition. The main parachute can be packed by an FAA rigger, a person under the supervision of a rigger, or the person intending to jump the parachute. From the back of the parachute, you can see that the reserve is inside the top half of the container and the main parachute is packed in the bottom half. You can also see the main deployment handle, which initiates the parachute deployment. Now we're going to talk about each piece of equipment in a little bit more detail. Here is a photo of the main pilot chute handle. It's found at the very bottom of the container and often called the BOC. You can see the little hacky handle is used to get a good grip on so that you can throw the pilot chute out into the airstream. It'll catch air and inflate. This is extremely important because this is what you need to initiate the parachute deployment process. The main cutaway handle is designed to release your main parachute if there's an issue. At one point in time, all of the skydiving manufacturers got together and in order to improve safety, they had started all designing their parachute systems in the same way with the cutaway handle located on the right side of the main lift web. You activate the cutaway handle by peeling the Velcro and pulling the cutaway handle down and throwing it away, letting go of the handle. This frees up your hands if you need them for anything else. As you start jumping your own parachute system, you may choose to hold on to the cutaway handle if it doesn't interfere with anything else you're doing. As part of the standardization meetings, the reserve handle is located on the left main lift web of most parachutes. The reserve handle initiates the deployment of your reserve parachute and is activated by pulling the reserve handle all the way out. Here is a close-up of the 3-ring release system and the reserve static line. After you pull the cutaway handle, the reserve static line automatically deploys the reserve parachute for you. This is a backup device only, and there are reasons to disconnect the reserve static line. To disconnect the reserve static line, you pull the red tab connected to the shackle. This is an extremely important part of the gear check because there are reasons to disconnect the reserve static line and you want to be sure that it is connected before you go on your skydive. Here is another close-up view of the 3-ring release system. As you can see, the small ring is held in place by the white closing loop, the medium ring is held in place by the small ring, and the medium ring also goes through the large ring. The 2 smaller rings are attached to the risers that connect to the main parachute. The white closing loop is held in place by the yellow cable that is connected to the cutaway handle. The automatic activation device is a piece of equipment that has saved a lot of lives. The AAD monitors your altitude and how fast you're going in free fall. If you're going too fast below a certain altitude, the AAD will automatically deploy your reserve parachute for you. All right, let's take a second and talk about why the AAD is used. The most common reason that people can think of is that if someone becomes unconscious, the automatic activation device will deploy the reserve parachute for them. But in reality, the #1 reason the AAD gets used is because people lose track of what altitude they are at. This is why altitude awareness is your #1 priority during your skydive. There is only so much that we can teach from a PowerPoint presentation. You really need to get hands-on with a parachute rig. Next time you are at the drop zone, grab an instructor and have them show you each piece of equipment, how it's operated, and how it's connected and works. On to the main canopy. Most parachutes today are manufactured with either 7 or 9 cells. Each cell consists of 2 openings at the front or nose of the parachute. The suspension lines connect your main canopy to your risers, and your risers are connected to your container by the 3-ring release system. From a side view, you can see the nose of the canopy, the tail of the canopy, and the suspension lines. There is also a piece of material above the risers called a slider. The slider is packed up at the top near the canopy, and as the parachute opens, the slider comes down the lines of the parachute. The slider is used to slow the opening of the parachute. Once inflated, the parachute performs like the wing of the airplane. Airflow under and over the wing generates lift as the parachute glides through the air. Here is a little better view of the risers. As you can see, the suspension lines come down and attach to the top of the risers, and the bottom of the risers are connected to the container by the 3-ring release system. Let's spend some time talking about the toggles. After your parachute is open, your toggles are what you use to steer and control your parachute. On a main canopy, the toggles are usually yellow, and on a reserve parachute, the toggles are usually red. When a parachute is packed, it's packed with the brakes set in half position. This means that once your parachute is open, your parachute is flying forward at half speed. In order to release the brakes, you pull the toggles all the way down into a full flare position. In order to turn the canopy, you pull the right toggle to turn right, left toggle to turn left. Always look in the direction that you are turning to make sure you're not going to hit somebody else. And also remember that when you do turn your canopy also dives during the turn. The harder you pull a toggle down, the harder your canopy turns and also dives. The smaller turn you do, the less a canopy will dive. This means at low altitudes or near to the ground, you cannot do a hard turn. If you do a hard turn, your canopy is going to dive, and that could cause you to get injured. Here is another view of the toggles before the brakes have been released. You can see the excess brake line that's stowed to the risers while the parachute is packed. To release the brakes, you'll pull down on the yellow toggles to a full flare position and then let back up. This is what a reserve parachute looks like. What you need to know is that everything we have covered related to a main parachute applies to your reserve parachute. It's going to fly the same way with your toggles, and it's going to be packed in the brakes half set position, so you'll need to do a full flare again with the toggles to release the brakes. Now let's look at some other equipment you'll be using on your skydive. The altimeter counts down in thousands of feet, and sometimes they do fail. If you are ever unsure about your altitude, deploy your parachute. The altimeters need to be handled with care because they are somewhat sensitive. As you leave the airplane, your first 1,000 feet will take about 10 seconds. Every 1,000 feet after that will take about 5.5 seconds as you gain speed up to the terminal velocity of about 120 miles an hour. It's important to check your altitude every 3 to 5 seconds, or after each maneuver, or when you're unsure about your altitude. If you have any concern about your altitude or where you're at, or don't know your altitude, best to deploy your parachute. Altitude awareness is extremely important. You'll also become familiar with the acronym SHAGR: shoes, helmet, altimeter, goggles, gloves if it's cold, aerial, and radio. It is your responsibility to make sure that you get 4 gear checks before your skydive. Before you put the gear on, after you put the gear on, before you get on the airplane, and shortly before you exit, your instructor will give you another gear check inside the airplane. It is your responsibility to make sure you get all 4 gear checks. All right, review time. How many gear checks and when? How many do you get? When's the first gear check? When's the second gear check? When's your third gear check? And when's your fourth gear check? Now let's talk about the parachute opening. There are 3 stages to a parachute opening: the activation stage, deployment stage, and inflation stage. During activation, the jumper throws the pilot chute that's inside of the BOC with the hacky handle. That pilot chute is thrown, it catches air and begins to inflate. During static line and IAD jumps, that process is initiated for you by your instructor. During the second stage of deployment, we can see that the pilot chute is now inflated and catching air. When the pilot chute is inflated, it opens the container and pulls the deployment bag out of the container. The deployment bag is what contains your main parachute while it's being packed. The suspension lines are held in place next to the deployment bag, usually by rubber bands or magnets. During the third stage of inflation, the deployment bag is pulled off of the canopy by the pilot chute and begins to catch air and inflate. We call this the snivel phase because your parachute will sit and appear to snivel above you. And here's a fully open parachute. The entire opening process usually takes about 3 to 5 seconds. Time to get hands-on again. Have your instructor show you the deployment process. Actually pull the pilot chute out of the BOC, pull the deployment bag out of the container to full line stretch, have them show you how the deployment bag comes off of the main parachute, and have them show you how the main parachute snivels and begins to inflate as the slider comes down the lines of the parachute. Once your instructor has pulled the main parachute all the way out of the container and showed you what it looks like laid out on the ground, this is a great time for them to introduce packing. Once we've initiated the canopy deployment process, it takes about 3 to 5 seconds for the parachute to open. After that, we have to decide if that parachute is safe to land or not. There are 3 main questions we look at in deciding whether a parachute is safe to land. First question, is the canopy there? If you look up and you don't see anything, good chances are we're going to have to use the reserve parachute. Second question, is the canopy square or mostly square? And we'll look a little bit more detailed as to what that means a little bit later. Third question, can I steer the parachute? In order to see if we can steer the parachute, we're going to need to do what's called a controllability check. Remember, when a parachute is packed, it's set with half brakes. In order to release the brakes, we're going to pull the toggles all the way down to a full flare position, let back up, and then do another full flare. After we've done 2 flares, then we can try to see if we can do a left turn, a right turn, and then another flare. If the canopy is there, canopy is square, and the canopy is steerable, most likely it's going to be safe to land. You have to decide by 2,500 feet whether or not you're going to keep the main parachute or cut it away and use your reserve parachute. 2,500 feet is called the decision altitude. Review time. How many gear checks do you get and when do you get those gear checks? After the parachute opens, what 3 questions do we ask to determine if the parachute is safe to land? What are the steps of a controllability check? What is your decision altitude, and what does decision altitude mean?